Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development program, and in particular the AWD1100 C# Programming Fundamentals course, I've been doing a series of video presentations based on the textbook for the class, that textbook being, as you can see on the screen, Muroc C# 2015. So far I have done all 3 chapters from section 1, the 8 chapters in section 2, the 5 chapters in section 3, and the first 2 chapters in section 4. Alright, so I'm going to jump right now into chapter 19, how to work with bound controls and parameterized queries. And as I've mentioned to you before, I'm not giving chapters 18, 19, and 20 as much airtime, so to speak, as I will chapters 23 and 24. Alright, so we'll get back to those, in a little bit. Alright. So, how to work with bound controls and parameterized queries. Notice we have 7 applied objectives and 2 knowledge objectives. First, format the data in a bound text box by setting properties for the control. Bind a combo box to a data source. Use the properties and methods of the binding source class to navigate and modify the rows in a data set. Create and use parameterized queries with a data source. Customize the tool strip control by adding controls to it, deleting controls from it, formatting, etc. And let's see, customize the appearance and operation of a data grid view control. Use a data grid view control as part of a MasterDetail form. And our 2 knowledge objectives: explain why you might want to use code to work directly with the binding source object for a data source, and describe the use of a parameterized query and the tool strip control that generates or gets generated for that query. Alright, this stuff that's in here can get at least a bit complex. Now, what do I mean? Well, notice what we have in here. What we're saying is when we bring a column up, that being unit price, we want it formatted as currency with 2 decimal places. That isn't all that tough. Alright? But we can go in and we can notice there are literally a lot of different, properties in here that if we want to or need to, we can go and manipulate. One that you might want to think about, for example, is back color. What if for some reason, we had unit price is not a good example, but if we had something that was negative, we might want the background color or the actual color of it itself to be red, as an example. Alright, so here is a combo box that's bound to a data source. Alright, so what do we have here? States. Alright, so what we want to be able to display here is the name of the state, but the actual value member, or what we want to store in the database itself, is the code. So for instance, I live in Missouri, so we would display MISSOURI right here, but in the database we'd have MO type of thing. You'll notice there's a bunch of these. There's the data set, the table adapter manager, etc. These are what are typically referred to as invisible controls because they're not within the purview. They're not within the actual form itself. They're actually down in the bottom of the screen. So you technically, although they're there, it's like you don't see them, if that makes any sense. So when you're binding here, you are taking the fields that are in a data source and connecting them to the equivalent fields in the database. It's a combo box. Here's some of the fields that you could conceivably use: data source, display member, value member, selected value. right, position and count. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can do with this. Some of this should make sense. Adding a new record, completing an edit, canceling an edit, removing what you'd started adding, move to the beginning of the records, move to the previous record, move to the end of the records, move to the next record type of ideas. So they've got some examples here, and you'll notice the word this that we see in many different programming language. This means the current one. So this is the current row, for example. All right, here's code that moves to the next row and displays the position and the count. Well, one thing about this is typically what you'd want to do, and again, this is up to you as a programmer, or if you're programming for somebody, what they want. In other words, if you've got 50 records and you're on record 50 and somebody clicks the next record, typically you want it to go back to the beginning. All right? Either you'll want it to go back to the beginning or stay right where it is, because there is no 51st record. In much the same way, if you're on record 1 and somebody clicks the button previous, you typically you'll want it to wrap around to the last record, record 50, or stay where it currently is. But again, what it does with that is totally up to you. All right. Now, I mentioned in the last chapter, we talked a little bit about these parameterized queries. This is what allows you to grab information from the text boxes and whatever else you're using there as the program is running. So parameterized queries, for lack of better words, allow you to go in and work with, they allow your code to be more interactive. All right. So again, we could come in here. This field right here, we wouldn't be able to change, and that's a primary key, but we could come in and change any of these. Notice it is showing the word Texas. If we click down there, if we wanted to change it to Alabama, we could click there and change it, etc. Probably would also necessitate changing the zip code. All right. So the generated code for a parameterized query, some of it will be created for you, but again, as mentioned before, it says after it has been improved. Well, typically, once you start making changes where you are adding layers of complexity to your program, then you're going to have to write some of your own code. Hopefully that just makes sense. All right. All right, here's the syntax, as it says, of the method for filling a table using a parameterized query. The items collection editor for a tool strip control. There's some neat stuff you can do with tool strips. All right. Here's some of the properties that you can work with, but you can set these things up to have them. For instance, if you wanted to have something that was read-only, I believe you can do that, where everything else would be grayed out in here, possibly even the plus sign. So you could look at things, and this all goes with databases and talking about things like views. In other words, if you're working with something, what do you want to show the user, and maybe what do you not want to show the user? I always give the example to my students where I say, if I go into a bank and I walk up to a teller, a bank teller, I should be able to tell him or her, I should be able to do probably 3 different things. Get my current balance, deposit money, or withdraw money. But if I go in and I walk up to a bank teller and say, I want to take out a loan, they're going to push me to a personal banker. Why? Because the personal banker is going to have, they'll be able to see information about me that a teller could not see. The view that a teller has is very limited. It's very narrow in scope. The view that a personal banker would have would be much less narrow in scope, much wider in scope. All right. All right. I'm not gonna go over any of this code. It doesn't really make sense. But they have you create this customer maintenance application in here. And they go over the code, as you can see. All right. The smart tag for a data grid view control. All right. you can go in here and make changes virtually to the look and feel of anything that you're putting in here. You can change things like, notice here, the header text. Maybe instead of invoice date, you want invoice space date or something like that. You can change things like the maximum size input that you're putting in. So there's a lot of different information that you're allowed to come in and make changes to. All right, formatting columns with the cell style builder block. Again, this stuff that's in here, we're talking now about aesthetic type of things. All right, how do we want something to look? Here's an example. We already mentioned this. If it's currency and there's a negative amount, do you want it red? Do you want it in parentheses? How many decimal places do you want, etc. So here's a form that uses a data grid control to display the data from a related table. So we could do all this stuff here, and you'd come in here and you'd put in the name of a customer, the address of a customer, and the city, state, zip, or you'd grab that by just putting in, probably we just put in the ID and that would be filled in for us. Then when we click the Get Customer here, that would say, okay, for that customer, show us their buying history, for lack of better words. All right? All right. And here's an example of that. Now, again, I realize that I'm giving you kind of the 35,000 foot view. In other words, you're getting this from really high up, very generalized. And as I mentioned, the reasons I gave you before, that's the reasons I'm doing it this way. Here's the schema, and what the schema will basically do is it will show you the different field names, and when you dig through there, you can usually see the types as well. And again, my guess is most of this code will not be generated for you, and as mentioned previously, the more complex you get with this, the more code you will have to add. Okay? So here is adding a parameterized query. So I can come in here and I can either get an individual product or I can have it go through and give me all products. All right? Again, it just depends on what we want. Here is a master detail form. All right, and what is that? Again, we looked at this before, but pretty much, what I think this is going to be is if we put in that invoice ID, it's going to fill in all this, all right, and then it's going to show us everything that was in that particular invoice. So the master in this case would be the invoice, and the line items that were in there would be the details. Okay, all right, and you can have similar things. That's pretty much it. Now I realize again, 13 minutes in, it'll be 14 when I finish, but I do realize that I'm not giving you a boatload with this stuff. I'm just, again, giving you a kind of a high-level overview. So when I come back in a couple minutes, we will be going over Chapter 20, the last chapter in this section, which is on how to use AWD1100 to write your own data access code. So again, we are kicking it up to another level, so to speak. And rather than having the system write most of the code for us, we'll write our own. Okay? And I will be back with that in just a couple minutes.